let's assess the merits of utilitarianism and whether we have good reasons for thinking utilitarianism is true. Now, when we assess a moral theory, we see how well that moral theory conforms to the most obvious moral truths. And that will be the case for utilitarianism. We'll measure utilitarianism against its ability to capture the most obvious moral truths. And a good theory is one that's going to capture the most obvious moral truths and the largest number of them. But if you have a theory that implies that, for instance, you would be morally justified in enslaving everyone in the world and subjecting them to your whim, that suggests there's something deeply flawed with your moral theory. Or if you have a moral theory that implies that children are as morally responsible as adults, that seems to suggest there's something flawed with your moral theory. A good moral theory would seem to imply that it would be wrong for you to enslave everyone and subject them to your whim. So that would be one of those obvious moral truths that a good theory has got to get right for us to have a good reason to accept it. So we assess moral theories relative to their ability to capture the most obvious moral truths, to correspond to them or cohere with them. You might think, well, what seems morally obvious to me may not to someone else. So what good does that do us? Well, it's true, there is going to be some disagreement. But remember, there is a lot of overlap in our judgments about the most obvious moral truths. You don't find a lot of people debating, for instance, the merits of child molestation, or whether kidnapping is a good thing, or whether we should institute animal sacrifices. Those are ones that most people take for granted, that child molestation is wrong, that kidnapping is wrong, that animal sacrifices are wrong. So even though there's going to be some disagreement, you'll also find that there's going to be a lot of overlap as well in your most basic moral judgments and someone else's most basic moral judgments. Also remember that there is much less moral disagreement than we think there is, because we confuse moral disagreement with a different kind of disagreement. One example is that in some Eastern cultures, they don't eat meat because they believe that when their loved ones die, they become reincarnated as animals. And so you just take the claim, it's wrong to eat meat, and that view, that claim, looks to be inconsistent with the view of our culture, where it seems morally permissible to eat meat. And there looks to be a conflict there between those two cultures, between those two moral points of view. But in fact, there is no moral conflict at all. Both cultures agree from the moral point of view. What they agree on is that you shouldn't eat grandma. What they disagree on is whether grandma is a cow or fertilizing the daisies. They disagree over the metaphysics of human existence, not the morality. Sometimes you'll find philosophers accept a moral theory, even though on occasion that theory will conflict with what seems to be an obvious moral truth. For instance, I have some friends who are natural law theorists. Natural law theory is a type of objectivism. And as natural law theorists, they think lying is always wrong, no matter what. Lying is always wrong. And that seems implausible at first sight, at least. That surely, if you can save someone's life by lying, you should lie. And many of them will admit, yeah, that's not a great feature of my view. I'm not all that comfortable saying lying is always wrong. So then why do they accept the view? Because they think the view gets many more things right that other theories can't capture. Natural law theory, for instance, emphasizes the nature of human beings and what we're good for and what capacities we have that make us unique from other types of creatures. That's one of the few theories that actually does that. And they might be so convinced that a good moral theory is going to focus on the nature of human beings that they're willing to accept, as a consequence, lying is always wrong, because they think their theory does a better job capturing more of the obvious moral truths than other theories do. So, in weighing these theories, we are, in a sense, engaging in a sort of cost-benefit analysis. What does the theory allow us to keep that we think is pretty obvious? And what will we have to give up? Because no moral theory is going to let us have it all. If that were the case, then there wouldn't be any debates about which theory is true. It'd be pretty obvious. The reason there are debates is because no theory conforms entirely to our intuitions about the most obvious moral cases. And one reason for that is that often our intuitions are inconsistent. So, for instance, if you're compelled by cultural relativism, if you're attracted to cultural relativism and the idea that each culture is its own moral standard, that the culture determines what's right or wrong, well, that doesn't seem entirely implausible. There seems to be something to be said for the idea that a culture is its own moral standard. There's something intuitive about that. So you might lean toward cultural relativism. But then when you learn that cultural relativism implies that the United States did not make moral progress with the abolition of slavery, or that Martin Luther King would have been wrong in his fight for civil rights, you might think, yeah, even though cultural relativism seems plausible to me, those are implications I can't accept. That it seems more obvious to me that the United States made moral progress and Martin Luther King was right in his fight for civil rights than the idea that each culture is its own moral standard. So you would have to give up on cultural relativism and look elsewhere for your moral theory. One argument in favor of utilitarianism is that at first sight, the theory captures something that we take to be pretty obvious about morality and doing what's right, which is that doing what's right has to do pretty much with getting the right result, the morally right result, producing the best consequences. We think that the praiseworthy person is the one who goes around and tries to maximize what is good and minimize what is evil. Think of paradigmatic, morally praiseworthy people like Mother Teresa or Gandhi. And if you think about what moral principle they lived their lives by, it seems like it was maximize what's good and minimize what's evil. And so if that's the moral principle that the morally praiseworthy person seems to be following, there's a lot to be said for the utilitarian theory in that case. Also, people show their utilitarian inclinations or intuitions when they say things like, what someone does in the privacy of their own home is their own business. The idea being that if they're not affecting others in any way, if they're not producing consequences for others, then it doesn't matter. And that's basically the utilitarian point of view, that as long as you're not affecting others in a certain way, affecting them for the worst, why should it matter what you do, let's say, in the privacy of your own home? So when people express that argument, they are giving a kind of utilitarian way of thinking or using a utilitarian way of thinking. Another reason in favor of utilitarianism is that the theory implies that there is only one exceptionless moral rule, which is produce the best consequences. The theory is nice and simple. You have one exceptionless obligation: produce the best consequences. Always maximize what's good and minimize the bad. Other theories, like non-consequentialism, which are basically the opposite of utilitarianism. Non-consequentialists say it's not the consequences that make, let's say, promise-keeping right. It's the nature of the act itself. And promise-keeping is the sort of act that is right in and of itself, regardless of its consequences. The non-consequentialist might say, yeah, clearly promise-keeping has good consequences, but that's not what makes it good. That's not what makes it obligatory. It's because when you make a promise, you obligate yourself to someone in such a way that you need to fulfill your promise. That's just what it is to make a promise. You create an obligation for yourself, and it has nothing to do with what consequences will ultimately result. if we go around keeping our promises. So the non-consequentialist view argues that there's more than one sort of basic moral rule. For the utilitarian, there's only one: produce the best consequences. For the non-consequentialist, it might be, well, keep your promises, do good to others, help out others in need, don't lie. Those would be some of the more obvious ones. And those can't be justified by referring to something else, some other principle that's more basic than they are. And the utilitarian says, once you go that route, it seems like you're going to end up with inhumane results, because you're going to run into cases where you could actually make people better off by doing something that would violate one of these more basic moral rules. So, for instance, suppose you're living during a time of incredible famine, and there are just a few people who are rich and have food, and your family is starving. And so by stealing some food from these rich people, you can prolong the life of your family. Well, in that case, many of us think, well, the stealing is actually morally justified in that case, especially since it's not really going to hurt the rich person to lose that bit of food, and it will do great things in helping to keep your family alive. And a moral theory which said, you know what, stealing is wrong. Even in that case, you should still not steal. The utilitarian is going to say, what are you talking about? That seems to be a matter of just wanting to fulfill these rules rather than trying to help out fellow human beings and make the world a better place, in a sense. Or if we could lie to save some person's life, there might be moral theories which say, you know what, you should never lie. And the utilitarian is going to say, wait a second, why? If there are these improbable cases, but possible cases, where lying could save someone's life, like you're living during World War II, and you're hiding a Jewish person at your home, and a Nazi knocks on your door and asks whether you're hiding anyone in your home, it seems in that case that you would have the obligation to lie. And it would be wrong to say, well, there's this rule, moral rule, you shouldn't lie. So I guess I just need to tell them the truth. The utilitarian is going to say that seems inhumane. That seems like a moral theory that cares more about just fulfilling the law rather than producing what's good in the world. Now, many non-consequentialists will admit in those cases you should lie or you should steal. But we're going to get down to cases where they say, you know what, here's the stopping point. Even if you could get the best consequences by violating this moral rule, you shouldn't. So a non-consequentialist might say, look, if you cheat on your spouse, you ought to tell them. They have a right to know. Utilitarian's going to say, wait a second, we have to think about this because, let's say you're incredibly sorry that you would never do it again. Not that you just think that you wouldn't, but you would never do it again. And that telling your spouse would make them absolutely miserable and depressed and would ruin their life. Utilitarian might say, well, in that case, maybe you shouldn't tell. It's not going to get the best results. Whereas a non-consequentialist might say, regardless of what the results are going to be, you have the obligation to tell them that you cheated on them. And again, the utilitarian is going to say, well, that just seems like you care more about rules than persons. And morality has to do with persons. Morality applies to human beings. If there were no human beings, if there were no persons, there wouldn't be actual cases of rightness or wrongness in the world. So if morality applies primarily to persons, to fellow human beings, then it seems to go against the very nature of morality to just try to abide by these abstract moral rules rather than caring mostly about how what you do will affect others, what sorts of consequences that act will have in the future. Or think about torture. If you're a non-consequentialist, you might think, well, there are some cases where torture would be justified, not extreme torture, but lighter torture. But as a non-consequentialist, you might say, but no matter how many lives are at stake, no matter how many lives could be saved, the most grotesque torture that you could think of would never be justified. It would always be wrong. And let's suppose that by torturing someone, someone could save millions of lives. We're not saying that that's what happens. All we're saying is just imagine that scenario. And it's a possible scenario, improbable but possible. And in that case, utilitarian's going to say, wait a second, no matter how bad the torture is, if you have good reason to think it's going to save millions of lives, then it's obligatory to do it. That person ought to be tortured. Whereas a non-consequentialist is going to say, no, there's a cutoff here. No matter what consequences we could get, there comes a point where it's just wrong still to do that, even if we would be made better off in the long run. And the utilitarian, once again, is going to say, but that seems like you care more about rules than people. And morality has to do primarily with the relations between human beings. If utilitarianism is true, then we have a plausible standard by which we can not only assess our own actions, but also a standard by which we can assess the actions of others. And furthermore, a standard by which we can assess the moral code of other cultures. So first of all, utilitarianism as a standard for assessing our own acts. Think of subjectivism. If subjectivism is true, you have no guidance in how you ought to feel in response to certain moral situations, because how you feel actually determines the outcome in that moral situation, whether what happened was right or wrong. Whereas according to the utilitarian view, if something's producing the best consequences, that actually tells you that's something you ought to be for, that's something you ought to approve of, that's something you should want. So your desires, your feelings of approval or disapproval don't run mad and go in every direction and seem to be completely unconstrained, as the subjectivist says. Utilitarian view says, no, how you feel about things ought to be guided by which things are actually good. And that sort of gives us insight into how we ought to respond to the world. Also, utilitarianism gives us a standard by which we can assess the moral code of other cultures. Cultural relativists said, every culture has its own moral standard. No culture has a monopoly on moral truth, and every culture is equally correct and legitimate in its moral code and its moral beliefs. But you might think, that sounds great and all, but no culture is an island unto itself. Just because a culture is a separate culture doesn't mean that anything goes and they're justified in doing whatever they want as long as the majority in that culture approve of it. So for cultures that practice genocide, utilitarian's going to say, hey, I know that's a culture and they've got their way of thinking about things, but we can say, hey, that's wrong. Why? Because practicing genocide doesn't produce the best consequences, far from it. If cultural relativism is true, all we could say is, well, that's what they approve of. That's not what we approve of, but hey, who are we to say who's right or who's wrong? They're just different. The only way we could actually criticize or assess another culture's moral code is when that culture is acting inconsistently with it. But the code itself is free from any assessment, free from any judgment, free from any criticism. And it seems like a culture that practices racism or genocide is doing something wrong. Now, when we say that, you don't have to say it in such a way that you're saying, well, we're right and they're wrong and we're so much better than everyone else. That doesn't follow. Just noting that a culture would be wrong for practicing genocide doesn't mean you have to think your culture is better than everyone else. You could say, yeah, my culture has its own problems too. You don't have to say it with complete arrogance and confidence and with the idea that you're better than everyone else, that you know better than everyone else. You could actually say it with humility. You don't have to say it with some holier than thou quality. So the judgment itself that a culture would be wrong to commit genocide is not necessarily an arrogant judgment. It's the way in which you make the judgment that would make it arrogant. You could say, look, I don't know everything. I'm not infallible. But it definitely seems to me that a culture that just focuses on destroying an entire ethnic group is doing something wrong. You don't have to say it in such a way that you're saying, well, I know everything and they're ignorant and everyone should just listen to me. That's not required in making that moral judgment. So when people say, well, who's to say what's right or wrong? That's a common question. Who's to say? Especially because with a lot of moral issues, there's so much disagreement. It sounds like someone would just have to stipulate what the correct answer is. And the utilitarian says, what do you mean, who's to say? It's not a matter of who's to say. It's a matter of what would produce the best consequences. So moral knowledge is not mysterious. We know what to look for. That doesn't mean it's always going to be obvious what's right and what's wrong, because consequences are often hard to figure out or predict. But nevertheless, it's not a matter of just stipulation of saying, well, let's just let this person decide what's right or wrong. Who's to say? Utilitarian says it's not who, but what. And what tells us is what would produce the best consequences.